Hello YouTube, this is Mr. Gibson Guy, and I'm bringing you a new video on old cameras. This specific video, I'm giving it the working title, How Olympus Ruled Photography in the 1970s. Now, I started out my photographic journey in the 1970s. And today's photographers have an amazing array of tech available in modern cameras. But I was there to see it all being developed and applied one step at a time. Now, we're looking at an Olympus OM1. This happens to be an N model, using the later descriptions. But I'm going to show you, in the 1960s, cameras were pretty big and bulky and heavy and expensive. Here you see comparison with a Nichromat FTN. Yeah, it's an FTN, not an FT3. And you can see this is quite a bit different in size. I'll line this up more for the camera so you can see it. And the weight, just like you would expect, is considerably more, and the price was very expensive too. I'll do another comparison. The little bit newer camera, this is actually about close to the same date, a Nikon F2 without the motor drive, and you can see, wow, that's a big load of a camera. Now, the Nikon F2 was considered a professional camera in the day because of all the modularity, but the OM1s, which came out within a year of the original F2, was also a professional camera as well. But what happened is, in 1972, Olympus introduced the original M1. That was the original designation. The name brought a legal conflict with Leica, and they were soon changed to the OM1, Olympus M1, in other words. This new camera was a typical manual control camera of the day, all mechanical. It would only use a small battery to power the light meter. The rest of it was all just clockwork and gears. This new camera was scaled down to a significantly smaller and lighter and less expensive package. It was an instant hit and left all the other manufacturers scrambling to put their own products on a serious diet, because when people saw the size of the OM1 compared to the size of the other cameras of the day, they were like, I'll take the OM1 for obvious reasons. So that was, let's see, the OM1 continued to rule the photographic world into the middle of the decade. By that time, other manufacturers had introduced their own compact 35mm SLRs and started including automatic exposure control. That was a big deal when they got auto exposure control. So now the Olympus has been king of the hill for a while, but that starts to come to an end in the middle of the decade, because these other companies are bringing about these cameras which are similar size to the OM1, but have more modern features, because the features were changing in those days very fast, all the time. There was one thing after another, and he was trying to keep up, and it was amazing what cameras were doing. So in 1975, or right at the end, actually in November of 1975, Olympus introduced a new camera which was the same size and weight as the OM1, but significantly modernized. Yeah, I have one. right there. So we can take that Nikon lens cap away. Like that. So, as you can see here, these cameras are the same size. I think the OM2 weighs 10 grams more than the OM1, but they're very close. And they look different because this OM2 is all black and the OM1 has a chrome top on it and bottom plate, so it makes them appear different, but they really are the same size. Okay, so the new OM2, featured auto exposure, and it also featured something very unexpected at the time. Another camera company, Minolta, had been developing new metering systems and had come up with a new built-in meter, but their engineers didn't see a use for it. This new meter used a CDS cell in the pentaprism, like normal, and a second silicone cell in the mirror box, reading light from the film plane itself. Now, Minolta engineers shelved the project, but the Olympus engineers heard about the patent and they had other ideas. So Olympus went to Minolta and said, you know that new metering system that you guys developed and patented that you're not using? Well, we'd like to use it. We'd like to buy it from you. So they worked out a deal, apparently, for about 5 years that Olympus could have an exclusive on this system that Minolta had but didn't use. And what happened is electric flash had been around for a long time, but for several years, but it hadn't really caught on that much. There was like Honeywell flash units and a couple different companies that made them, so the camera companies didn't get too involved in flash at first. They kind of left that there. But you see, this new system that Olympus came up with used the new metering control to the output from the electronic flash unit. In other words, flash unit now, instead of using a separate light meter window on the flash itself, used the meter in the mirror box and read the flash in direct time in real time off of the film plane in the OM2. So you got your most accurate flash control, and then when the film had gotten enough exposure, the light meter would turn off the flash. Of course, electronically we deal with a whole different time system than what we deal with in real life. The longest exposure on the electronic flash was 1/1000th of a second. So they were cutting it short down to 1/5000th or 1/10,000th of a second, however much light they needed from the flash unit before they got an exposure. But this gave the most accurate flash metering that you could get on any camera. So it was a tremendous boon for Olympus. They had gone from having the smallest camera to having the smallest camera that was an automatic exposure and that had state-of-the-art flash metering on it. So this was a big deal. And I still wonder what must have gone on at Minolta after the OM2 came out. And they said, whoa, this is our system? So, hey, I guess whoever gets the rights first is the one who wins. So, with their compact size and weight, auto exposure control, and state-of-the-art flash metering, Olympus continued to rule 35mm photography for the remainder of the decade. And then in 1980, their exclusive use agreement expired, and both Nikon and Yashica Contax had already been lining up new camera models that would be featuring OTF, off-the-film flash control. So when 1980 rolled around, Olympus was no longer king of the hill. because there were these other ones that were coming out. Let's see, like that Nikon F3, and then shortly after that, the Nikon FE2 went to optic-film flash metering. Nowadays, it's all considered regular stuff anybody would do, but when Olympus did this, first got this patent from Minolta, nobody else had thought about it. So it was a pretty tremendous thing that happened. In the 1980s, Olympus continued to develop new innovations, and in 1986 introduced a huge breakthrough with their OM4 Ti. This new camera, I don't have one here because I'm doing the ones from the 70s, but in 86 the OM4 Ti came out with its titanium top plate. This new camera offered electronic flash sync at all shutter speeds. No matter how advanced the OM2 was in its flash, it still was syncing at 1/60th of a second, which was not a very fast flash. You could use the flash with any of the lower speeds, but any of the higher speeds it would not sync, so you'd get blacked out part of your photo from the shutter curtain travel during that 1/125th of a second. Other companies before 1980 started experimenting with 1/25th of a second, and Nikon was the one that broke that record with the FM2, like the one that you see in this picture, which first synced at 1/200th of a second, which is not 1/125th and it's not 1/250th, it's in the middle. And then by the time they expanded it to the FE2, which also had the off-the-film plane flash measuring, Seiko had upped the metering speed to 1/250th of a second, and that was the top speed. By comparison, the Nikon F2 only synced at 1/60th. So the Nikon was a pretty big deal just because it would go to 1/250th, and that was topped in 1986 by the OM4 Ti. But there was one big problem. Unfortunately, in 1985, the year before the OM4 Ti came out, in 1985, Minolta had debuted their autofocus Maxim, which rendered all manual focus cameras now obsolete. It didn't matter what you could flash sync now. What mattered is that you have an entirely autofocus camera, because all of these cameras had just been found obsolete and they were out of date. So Olympus came out with their all sync speed camera, but it didn't really make any difference at that point because it wasn't autofocus, and that was the new thing. It all came out down to that. Now let me take you through just a couple of things through here. If you are a modern digital photographer these days and you like the idea of getting into some manual focus cameras, the Olympus OM1 and OM2 are big favorites. The OM1 really holds up very well and seems to be able to go forever, as long as you don't keep the shutter cocked all the time. When you're not using it, make sure it's exposed and not held back. The OM2 has been my favorite camera since way back in the day. I thought that was the coolest thing going, and it still is. I had an OM2 back in the mid-80s that was a chrome finish like this OM1 here. I got another OM1 over there in the corner as well. But the OM2 gave you all of these different things, and one of the things that Minolta did was they were very careful about keeping at least up through the early 80s, keeping everything interchangeable as much as possible. Olympus had a couple of motor drives that they had that worked on the OM1 and on the OM2. They called them Motor Drive 1 and a Motor Drive 2. And it wasn't the motor drive one for the OM1, it was, they went on either camera. So that was kind of good because other cameras were coming out with auto winders and motor drives, but it would only work on one camera. So Olympus kept this stuff interchangeable. Another thing that they had at the day was their auto winder. And they had a little bit different take on the auto winder. A lot of auto winders used just a battery compartment and motor, and they didn't have the grip on them like you see here. This happens to be a winder 1. See here? And it's distinguishable from the winder 2 because it has this rotary switch on it. It's on off, or you lift it and twist it and it goes to single. Turn it off again. This is for the OM1. I'm sorry, for the winder 1. This one here is a winder 2. And you can see on the bottom that it has a 3-way rotary selector. It's an off, you lift and twist, and it goes to single, lift and twist the other way, and it goes to sequence, and back to off. The other difference is there is this little grippy plastic stuff that they put on the handle itself you can grab. You get a little better purchase on the winder 2. The winder 1, it's just smooth there. The interesting thing was back in the day when Olympus, I keep saying Minolta, when Olympus was marketing these cameras, the real big deal that they had was the auto winder. I'm sorry, the motor drive. And if you couldn't go for $100 for the winder and its battery pack, you could go $100, be a cheapskate, and go for the auto winder. But what's happened through time, oh, I know why, it's got to take the cover off. This is the wrong one. We'll go with this one. This one will work because the cover's open on it. This winder. Oh, so the motor drives, they had these this cool nickel cadmium battery pack at the bottom of it. It held the batteries, and it was pretty small. It looked just like this, except it had a second knurled ring below this one that held the motor drive unit to the battery pack. But on the auto winders, it's all just one piece, like that. Let's see, does this work? I don't know if this works or not. Let's see. No. Nothing. I thought the battery was working in this. Ah. So that's what the auto winder sounded like. So I'm interrupting myself. So the thing about the motor drives and the auto winders is that all those motor drives that had their nickel cadmium battery packs, they were unique to Olympus, and they have been out of production for decades now. So if you have a motor drive, unless you have that big bulky AA battery pack that hangs down about a foot below the camera, you can't use it. But all the people that got the original auto winder, and I bought one of these I think for $7 online, and it worked. You just heard it. But the auto winders still work. Now, the other side of the coin is that back then, film and development cost about 1/10 what it costs today. So back then, an exposure to buy the film and shoot it, have it processed and printed, cost you about 10 cents a shot. Now it costs about $1 in exposure. So it's the use of auto winders and motor drives are probably not going to be something that you want to do very often. But they also, featured this on the OM1 and 2. This is what would be called a shoe 1, but it actually just says fix on it. And what the fix does, this is an OM1, but not an OM1N, is you put that in there and you turn it this way, and you have hot shoe on your OM1. Then if you had an OM1N, you would have what's called a shoe 4 right here. And this one had these two extra little barbs that went into these little holes here, as well as the screw-in hole. And the screw part goes in the other direction. So if you weren't using flash, you could remove your shoe and not have that on the camera, so it would be a little bit lighter, big deal, and a little bit less stuff sticking out on it that you don't need it unless you're putting the flash on. The shoe 4 worked on the OM1N and the OM2N. The shoe 2 and shoe 3 were for using OM2s without or with the other flash unit. Initially, they had a 310, and then they came out with these updated ones when they came out with N models of the OM1 and OM2, about 78. And they came out with a T20 and the T32, which were the updated ones. And these set your shutter speed to sync on your OM2. Of course, you had to manually set your shutter speed on the OM1s. But with this attached to your camera, you had the most modern, up-to-date flash unit and camera unit that there was. And this was it. I always wanted to have a black one, and I actually got one. And it actually works all these years later, amazingly. So that's the story of how Olympus ruled photography in the 1970s. I hope that you enjoyed it. Give me your stories about your favorite Olympus cameras from the 1970s and 80s, back in the glory days of manual focus cameras. And keep this in mind. I wouldn't mind if you wanted to subscribe to the channel. I have some other photography videos on here if you look through my homepage, and more stuff to come. There you can see I have a lot of old cameras here. All right, so until next time, this is Mr. Gibson Guy, and I'm saying good night.